So thank you all. We are Igor, University of California Cooperative Extension, Tara Kelly, University of California Cooperative Extension, and Francisco, whom you have already met. And I'm jumping from one USDA webinar to another. So let's see how we do. But you've heard from Mike and from Francisco about the need for this kind of information that would help municipalities prepare for and then respond to fires in built-up settings that destroy urban trees. So we are putting together a post-fire urban forestry guide. And the idea here, we'll just go briefly through this. The idea is to provide procedures and processes that are involved in urban forest management after a fire with the goal of maintaining that tree canopy and ideally growing and expanding it. And the idea behind the guide is to provide a single source, reasonably comprehensive source of information for two audiences. One is the people that work with trees professionally, and that obviously arborists or planners, but also people who might be in this situation after a fire. So city staff of various agencies, transportation departments, code enforcement. And then the other audience is the homeowners or the residents who, number one, would benefit from seeing what the process looks like, but also would get an idea of what is expected of them, what they can contribute to the process, and what they should expect from it. And again, I'll show you in more detail what the guide looks like, but I think you've heard enough about the need. The basic idea is that the fire in built-up areas is really not described well by either the wildfire framing or the structure fire framing when it comes to urban trees. And there are some very good guides for these other situations. There are guides for Wildland-Urban Interface. There are guides for firewise communities and fuels management. And in fact, there are guides for urban systems as well, such as that post-hurricane tree restoration guide, but there's nothing quite like what we're working on. So just to sort of set the stage, there are things that we have to exclude from this guide. And so, for example, Wildland-Urban Interface is really not the focus of this guide, again, because other guides exist. Fuel treatments, prescribed fire, that really isn't what we're focusing on. Because some of the concepts that are described in there are not quite useful in the urban situation. So what did we do? How did we do this? Well, we conducted literature reviews where we discovered there isn't a whole lot of literature specifically on this issue of urban fire and trees. We interviewed a number of urban forestry professionals. Some of you are probably on this call with a wide range of backgrounds, and we learned a number of things about how people deal with this problem. And then we looked at 5 case studies, 3 fires from California, the Tubbs Fire in Santa Rosa, the Thomas Fire in Ventura, and the infamous Camp Fire in Paradise, and then the Marshall Fire in Colorado and the Lahaina fire in Maui, Hawaii. And so when we put all this together, what does the guide look like? Well, the guide has 3 elements to it, or 3 components. The first component is the processes, procedures, and issues, and that's really what most of the guide is about. The second component are those case studies, and we'll have Tara touch on the case studies in just a minute. And the third component is the general arboriculture issues and processes that we didn't want to reinvent, but we did want to include here by reference so that the guide can serve as a single point of information, a single source of information. So if you look at the first element, really we talk about pre-fire planning and the importance of having inventories, knowing what you have in a fire, and you'll hear more about this from Tara. Then we go into the post-fire procedures. Cleanup turned out to be one of the things that people really wanted to know about. And then how do you work with a professional arborist, and what can you expect from a professional arborist? Assessing fire damaged trees and deciding what to do for both individuals and cities, and then restoring canopy, recovering trees, and what the processes are there as well. And then we go into the case studies. Tara will talk about those in a second. And then we include general arboricultural practices that are going to be needed after fire. How do you choose tree stock to plant? How do you set up planting sites? How do you establish trees? How do you prune young trees? How do you prune mature trees? How do you provide water? All of these things exist already, the materials, but we wanted to include them here so that somebody looking at the guide would get a sense of what kinds of issues they're going to need to deal with. I'll just show you one example. This is from chapter 2. This is cleanup. And you can see that the text, the narrative, is divided into two parts. First part for the homeowners, second part for public officials. And again, we're trying to provide links to the needed documents. So in this case, how do you deal with post-fire debris for the homeowners? And then for the municipal people, what do you actually do with that debris, right? When you're trying to manage an entire city. And then, of course, for the municipal side, we provide a lot more information on sources of funding and the interaction with state and federal processes. So that's the first part of the guide. And then I'll turn it over to Tara to talk briefly about the case studies, which sound perhaps the most interesting reading in the entire guide. Great. Thank you very much, Tara. I will just finish us off with the sort of, this is still very much a work in progress, so we're still learning, but here's some things we've learned thus far. This has been a challenging project because post-fire arboriculture is really a challenging concept. It's a mix of all kinds of things: horticulture, urban planning, code enforcement, and hazmat. And putting all of this together in one document is challenging because there's this stupendous variety of issues. Our goal really is to, number one, orient the reader to what kinds of things they need to be paying attention to, give them an idea of what the process will look like, and then give them enough resources so they can go and get additional information, again, without, on the one hand, feeling totally overwhelmed, and on the other hand, missing important pieces in the recovery. And I think Tara highlighted very nicely some of the pieces that were missed in some of these very large fires. The case studies were very informative, but it was interesting in that they were informative in very specific ways. In other words, we learned something specific and something a little bit different in each case study. Yes, there were some cross-cutting issues that came up, and we incorporated them in the guide. But I think if we continue to look at case studies, we will see issues and concepts that we have not yet seen. So again, work in progress. Each fire is a little bit different. The challenges is one of the big challenges is that the biology of trees after fire is not very well studied for urban systems. There's some information for forests, especially for Western conifer forests, but there's not a whole lot on urban trees. So that's a challenge in science. And then there's a few unknowns. We know, for example, this known unknown is that some of the audiences reading this guide will not have had much experience with trees, even if they're city employees who work in, say, hazardous materials. They don't necessarily work with trees. So again, as we go forward, in the next iteration of this guide, we'll be able to incorporate their feedback and adjust the information so it's useful for them. But the unknown unknowns is, again, as I mentioned, when we looked at the case studies, we learned something unexpected in each case study. And I suspect there are more unexpected things that we will learn from future fires as well, where we'll see additional pinch points in trying to recover urban trees after a fire. So that's all we've got. Thank you very much. That's our contact information there. And I can stop sharing and turn it back over to Heather and the other speakers.